Imagine summer without shade, water fetched by hand, and the air so thick it claws at your breath. Outside, even birds stop singing. For medieval Europeans, surviving a heat wave wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a question of life or death. In the blazing deserts of the Holy Land, the heat killed more crusaders than the enemy's swords ever did. Yet back home, far from the battlefields of Palestine, death stalked the common folk more silently, more slowly. There were no camps with banners flapping in the wind, just sun-baked cottages, cracked earth, and the echo of hooves pounding dust into the air. The heat came with the weight of inevitability. It silenced dogs, it parched the throats of children. It made strong men curse the very sun that had once guided their prayers. In a small Bohemian village in the late 13th century, dawn did not mean relief. Long before sunrise, the air hung heavy in the thatched attics. Infants cried in their cradles from thirst. Their mothers soaked cloth in warm well water and pressed it to their lips, hoping to soothe without words. As the sky turned copper and then gold, men shouldered scythes and trudged to the fields. Not because they could, but because they must. The hay would not cut itself, and no one could tell the weather when to wait. There was no word for heat wave in their tongues, yet they knew its signs as clearly as the coming of war. Blistered leaves curled on the trees before midsummer, streams ran sluggish, algae thick. Wells gave water that tasted of stone and copper. Chickens refused to lay. Even the village priest shortened sermons, fanning himself with his stole and warning parishioners of God's displeasure hidden in the sky's pitiless blaze. The poor were the first to feel its wrath. They owned no stone walls, no shaded gardens, no cellars deep enough to hide from heat. Their roofs, made of thatch and hope, trapped the warmth inside like ovens. By midday, the homes reeked of sweat, dung, and sour milk. Children ran barefoot over soil too hot to touch. Their skin burned red, and their eyes squinted into brightness that never relented. Sometimes, when the sun climbed highest and time itself seemed to slow, entire villages fell into a strange hush. No hammer rang from the forge, no carts rattled down the road. Men sat shirtless under trees with their mouths open, not speaking, not sleeping, simply trying to breathe. A pitcher of watered ale passed from hand to hand like a chalice. No one said it aloud, but they all knew if the rains did not come soon, their barley would not survive. And if the barley died, so would they. But the city dwellers did not fare much better. In the narrow alleys of Bologna, Avignon, or Prague, heat pooled between timber walls like boiling smoke. The stones underfoot steamed after midday, and beggars collapsed against cathedral doors where the shadow of saints promised a cooler death. Public fountains, few and precious, bubbled with diminishing force, and women fought over their place in line. Children ran through the streets, clutching earthen cups, some laughing, some weeping, their sweat-streaked faces marked by sun and desperation. Even the privileged were not safe. High-born ladies, locked away in tall keeps, wept under silk veils as their powdered skin turned sticky and blotched. Their maids fanned them with palms until their arms ached, and buckets of water were drawn endlessly from the well to pour over polished floors, hoping to cool the air. But no stone, no title, no coin could undo what the sun had decided. When the heat went on for too long, fear shifted into madness. Entire regions whispered of punishment, of dragons sleeping restlessly beneath the earth, of saints turning their faces away in judgment. At markets, the price of salt rose as butchers tried to preserve meat that spoiled in hours. Bread dried before it could be sold. And when the forest finally caught fire, somewhere beyond the horizon, but close enough to taste, the wind turned black, and everyone understood that the season was no longer a guest. It was a predator. In the chronicles of monasteries, there are no precise degrees recorded, no climate charts or meteorological readings. But we know the signs. We see the mass prayers for rain, the laws banning outdoor fires, the processions of barefoot penitents dragging crosses through dust-choked roads, begging the Virgin Mary to bring clouds. Still, the people did not perish without a fight. Heat may have been ruthless, but survival demanded invention. And day by day, hour by hour, they learned to reshape their lives around the sun's tyranny. Work began before the rooster crowed, and already fields emptied at noon. And bodies, pushed to the brink, sought shade and water with the same urgency as they sought salvation. Because in a world ruled by weather, adaptation was not wisdom. It was instinct. It was the only way to see another harvest. Long before the church bells rang or smoke curled upward from hearths, the first footsteps already echoed down the dew-slick paths between cottages. The day belonged to those who rose before the sun. In the countryside, men and women slipped from their beds, not because they were rested, but because it was their only chance to move before the world turned into a furnace. Their breath steamed in the chill of early morning, but that reprieve would not last. The moment the eastern hills blushed with light, time began slipping away, and the work had to be done before the heat could steal their strength. The peasant's schedule was not built on hours, but on the sun's fury. In July and August, a man might already be knee-deep in barley fields before the sky lost its lavender hue. The blades of his scythe hissed through damp grass while frogs leapt from the dew, silent witnesses to his haste. Children, barely tall enough to carry buckets, hauled water from the well before the dust in the air grew too heavy to breathe. Mothers rushed to hang laundry on lines stretched between posts, knowing that within the hour the fabric would be scorched stiff by a punishing light. This daily theatre of movement, sound and sweat ended abruptly as noon drew near. When the sun stood highest and shadows disappeared, life itself retreated, fields emptied, roads fell still. It was not laziness, nor some quaint village custom. It was instinct, sharpened by centuries of experience. To move under the noonday sun was to gamble with collapse, and no harvest was worth the price of a dead man. So the people paused. Some stretched out beneath the broad arms of lime or oak trees, where light sifted down like golden dust through trembling leaves. Others leaned against cool stone walls, drinking slowly from wooden flasks, their eyes half shut as if in prayer. This daily pause was sacred, not just for its mercy, but for its memory. In the stillness of those hours, even animals obeyed. Oxen rested in their stalls, panting through thick nostrils, while swallows clung to the shadowed beams of barns. Shepherds stretched beside their flocks in mountain pastures, listening to the distant chirr of cicadas and the lowing of cattle in the haze. There were no clocks, yet everyone understood when the hour of survival arrived. An invisible tolling that could be heard in the closing of shutters, the folding of arms, and the rare silence that descended upon whole villages. In some parts of southern Europe, that silence evolved into ritual. In the dry towns of Aragon and Apulia, the siesta became more than custom. It became law. Shopkeepers drew their awnings and bolted their doors, leaving the marketplace as empty as a chapel at midnight. Bakers dozed beside their ovens, while even the cats stretched long and still beneath tables. The only movement was the shifting of heat itself, curling up the sides of buildings and pressing against glass and wood, as if the sun wished to break inside. Even further north, where summers were less cruel but no less dangerous, people followed a similar rhythm. Jean de Braille, a 14th-century French farmer, urged his readers to rise with the stars in summer, to lead their animals to pasture while the mist still clung to the fields, and to bring them home before the world began to shimmer like heated iron. In alpine regions, whole herds were driven uphill during the warmest months, seeking air cool enough to keep milk from spoiling and animals from collapsing. Even shepherds knew high ground was more than safety, it was breath. And when the sun began its descent, life resumed not with joy, but with caution. The air, though lighter, still carried the memory of pain. Work resumed slowly, reaping, mending, cleaning tools dulled by morning toil. But every step taken was measured, every action weighed against the exhaustion that clung to muscles and minds. Dusk brought more than shadow, it brought permission to move again. People emerged from their homes like ghosts from crypts, their faces pink from heat, their hands cracked from labor and thirst. This ebb and flow of motion, of urgency and stillness, created a rhythm not found in any song, but etched into every bone and breath. It was survival through timing, through careful negotiation with the sun's relentless gaze. And while no one could command the weather, every man, woman, and child learned to anticipate its cruelty and retreat before its peak. Yet rhythm alone could not protect the flesh. To endure the heat, people also needed armor, but not of metal or chain. They needed clothing that could breathe, that could defend without suffocating. And so the next weapon in their quiet war against the sun was found not in ritual, but in linen. Though the heat was merciless, the rules of decency did not melt with the sun. In a world where modesty was a virtue and exposure was whispered of as sin, clothing became a battlefield, one where survival had to be negotiated with culture, class, and cloth. The medieval body, constrained by social norms and moral expectations, still found ways to breathe beneath the weight of woven fabric. Even without understanding thermodynamics, people learned how to turn simple materials into barriers against the sun's brutal radiance. The secret was not in shedding garments entirely, but in mastering the language of fabric and layering. A common laborer did not walk shirtless through a village square, but in the fields, far from the condemning eyes of priests or elders. The story changed. There, sleeves vanished, tunics loosened, and propriety gave way to practicality. Men stripped to the waist, wrapping their linen shirts around their hips as they swung scythes across the hayfields, glistening with sweat beneath straw hats held together with twine. The body was not displayed to provoke, it was exposed to survive. Linen ruled the summer. Its breathability, its uncanny ability to wick away sweat and dry quickly, made it the fabric of the living. Beneath every overdress or surcoat, beneath embroidered robes or coarse smocks, there was always a layer of linen close to the skin. This under-tunic, sometimes dyed but more often plain, was the first and last defense against heat. Women, too, adapted within the strictures of custom. A village wife might hitch up her skirts, knotting the heavy fabric at the hips to free her legs and allow the breeze to do its sacred work. The gesture, while modest by necessity, carried an intimacy, a silent confession that the sun respected no gender, no station, no tradition. In isolated corners of the world, beyond the reach of sermons or scrutiny, even the more refined found ways to cheat the heat. A noblewoman might recline in a shaded room, her silk sleeves unlaced, her veil removed, sipping wine cooled in a stone basin, her composure intact even as her skin betrayed the warmth. But clothing was not only about fabric, it was about design. Tailors and seamstresses, whether they served kings or carpenters, understood that garments must move as the air moves. Loose sleeves, wide hems, slits at the thigh or underarm. These were not just decorations, but innovations. Garments opened not only to display wealth or craftsmanship, but to let breath pass through. And breath, in the heat of July, was salvation. Color, too, was a weapon. In a time when dyes were costly and often symbolic, pale hues gained unexpected favor during the burning months. Light-colored tunics, undyed linen shifts, and soft ochre dresses became common sights, especially among those who labored under open skies. The sun clung less to white than to black, less to beige than to crimson. Even in the marketplace, where peacocks strutted in vibrant wools during cooler seasons, the palette of summer turned pale, washed out, subdued, less a fashion choice than a surrender. And still, the head needed its crown. Men bound kerchiefs across their foreheads, soaked in well water and tucked beneath the brims of broad hats woven from straw, reeds, or willow. Women wrapped veils tightly around their brows, not only in reverence, but to shield themselves from sunstroke. The veils protected what society deemed most sacred: a woman's face, her modesty, and, by extension, her family's honor. Yet within those folds of cloth, a second protection was at work, one against the blistering kiss of the sun and the burning breath of August winds. Even the aristocracy, robed in silks and lined with fur in winter, turned to lighter, finer textures in summer. Delicate linens, translucent veils, and costly imported cottons became treasured for more than their beauty. They were tools of endurance. Silk, when finely spun, clung less than wool and shimmered like water under torchlight, reflecting away heat as much as it entranced the eye. In hot courts and parched manners, fashion met function in a dance, choreographed not by trend but by temperature. And in all of this, accessories whispered their own stories. Fans, borrowed from the East and brought home by crusaders, spread their elegant wings in noble hands, fluttering with the faint promise of motion in still air. Parasols, primitive yet precious, shielded the elite as they crossed sunlit courtyards, sometimes carried aloft by servants whose arms trembled not from effort, but from the fear of failing to cast the promised shade. In a world without taps, pumps, or pipes, water was never taken for granted, least of all in the choking heat of summer. Every drop had to be earned, drawn from deep wells, ladled from sun-warmed barrels, or gathered in trembling buckets carried from springs half a mile away. Water was not simply a resource. It was the difference between endurance and collapse, between a field left green or lost to dust. When the sun turned cruel and the earth cracked beneath bare feet, medieval people clung to water as their most sacred ally. In the countryside, families rose before first light, not only to reap the cool air, but to fetch water before it turned too warm to drink. At the village well, wooden pails clattered against stone rims while voices murmured in fatigue. Children, bleary-eyed and barefoot, balanced yokes across narrow shoulders, the water inside sloshing with each step. And as the day advanced, those same buckets would serve every purpose, drinking, cooking, washing, and cooling, until the last drops vanished into the evening soil. But not all water was equal. What came from a clear spring was coveted like silver. What came from a shallow well was a gamble. In towns, that gamble grew riskier. Public fountains and cisterns offered access, but never abundance. Servants queued in silence beneath awnings, their linen kerchiefs soaked with sweat, their fingers whitening around wooden handles. For the poor, there was little choice but to drink what was available. Thin beer, brewed weak to avoid illness, became the daily drink of laborers. Not for its taste, but for its safety. Even sour ale was better than foul well water that reeked of rust or decay. Yet people longed for more than liquid. They yearned for immersion, for the shock of coolness on skin, the momentary vanishing of heat beneath a surface that did not burn. And so they bathed. They bathed not for ritual or even cleanliness, but for relief. Boys leapt into streams without ceremony. Girls waded ankle-deep beneath the willows, their laughter rising above the drone of insects. In rural France, a river bend became a sanctuary, and in Bohemia, a mill pond echoed with splashes as men lowered themselves carefully, knees first, into the weedy stillness. In cities, the desire for bathing created tension. The Seine in Paris, once a place of commerce and faith, became a stage for scandal during the hottest days. Men stripped naked and plunged into the current, ignoring both warning signs and ecclesiastical reprimands. Women cooled their feet in shallow basins outside tenement doors, shielding their faces with aprons as passers-by stared. Eventually, authorities intervened. Edicts were passed, fines were issued, but still the people bathed. The risk of sin or punishment was, for many, less frightening than the risk of collapse in the heat. For those who could not bathe publicly, or dared not, there were other means. The wooden tub, simple and round, became a vessel of mercy. Water was hauled, heated only lightly, and poured in slow arcs across aching shoulders. Two people might share a bath, not for romance, but for economy. Public bathhouses, too, flourished, especially in cities like London, Prague, or Florence. Though often accused of immorality, these bathhouses served a deeper need. They offered tepid pools, cool chambers, and gentle attendants who whispered as they worked. In summer, the water was barely warmed, and patrons soaked in silence, their faces turned to the ceiling, eyes closed against the weight of their own skin. Not all relief came from full immersion. Small comforts mattered. Wet cloths wrapped around wrists or necks, rags dipped in well water and draped across foreheads. In workshops and fields, laborers paused to pour water over their heads, gasping as the coolness ran down their backs and soaked the collar of their shirts. In kitchens, jugs stood near open doors, their clay sides slick with condensation, and in the absence of luxury, even the act of washing one's feet before sleep became a kind of ritual, an act of reclamation in a world that never cooled. Those with wealth sought greater relief, cellars deep enough to chill wine. Clay amphiborae kept in shadowed corners, filled with meltwater brought down from nearby hills. In some regions, crude sorbets appeared, crushed snow, flavored with syrup or fruit, consumed by nobles and envied by all. These were rare, precious things, born of privilege, sustained by distance and labor, but they showed a longing universal across class and creed, the need to escape the furnace, if only for a moment. Yet not even water could undo the damage once heat had taken hold. A man could wrap himself in linen, retreat beneath a tree, or soak his feet in the nearest stream, but sooner or later he needed shelter. And in the age before thermometers and insulation, shelter meant far more than a roof overhead. It meant survival carved from wood, mud, and stone. Across Europe, from the chalk hills of England to the parched plains of Aragon, medieval people shaped their homes with one unrelenting force in mind: the sun. Not to embrace it, but to resist its fury, to lock it out, to survive its breathless siege day after day. In the countryside, the humblest peasant cottage was not as crude as it seemed. Builders, mostly the very families who would live within the walls, knew instinctively how to work with the earth. They packed thick layers of clay, straw, and dung into timber frames, forming walls that not only held up the roof but held back the heat. Some homes used stacked stones or wattle and daub, others were built with sun-dried bricks or even turf. But they all shared one principle: thickness meant defense. Thick walls stored the chill of night and surrendered it slowly through the day, while outside the world withered under the sun's glare. Windows, when they existed at all, were not for views or decoration. They were narrow, deep-set slits covered with parchment or oiled cloth, sometimes sealed tight with wooden shutters when the sun crossed the southern sky. Their purpose was not to let in the light, but to keep it out. During the hottest hours, families sat inside half-darkened rooms, speaking in low voices, waiting for the air to shift. Outside, the village was silent. Inside, children slept on packed dirt floors, dogs curled in corners, and mothers fanned themselves with bundled wheat sheaves, their backs pressed to the coldest wall they could find. At night, the ritual reversed. Doors were unlatched, shutters unbarred, and the breeze, faint though it was, invited in. People placed water-soaked cloths near openings or left earthen bowls beneath windows, hoping the evaporating moisture would cool the air. Beds were moved closer to doorways or even dragged outside, if decency allowed. And above them, the stars blinked through the haze, a reminder that, for a few hours, the sun no longer ruled the sky. In the Mediterranean world, where summer's fire burned longest, the very layout of homes revealed an ancient genius. Many were built around internal courtyards, shaded from above, surrounded by thick walls that deflected the heat, and enclosed gardens, wells or fountains at their center. These hidden spaces, calm, green, and still, acted as lungs for the house, drawing in cool air, exhaling quiet peace. The walls themselves were often whitewashed with lime, not for beauty but for survival. The pale surfaces repelled sunlight, keeping interiors bearable even when the outside world shimmered with heat. In southern Spain, in the cities of Al-Andalus, Moorish builders perfected the art of coolness. Water flowed through narrow channels between tiled walkways. Trees cast dappled shadows over marble benches. Courtyards brimmed with roses and citrus trees. Not for scent alone, but because their leaves offered shade and their fruits held water. In palaces like the Alhambra, entire rooms were constructed around the sound of dripping fountains and the motion of air passing through carved screens. These were not luxuries. They were weapons against climate. For those who lived in stone towers and rule-bound courts, they were often the only protection. And yet, even for the wealthiest, architecture had limits. In regions where cities outgrew their rivers and walls grew closer by the year, the heat became trapped, thickened, distilled, inescapable. So people did what they always had. They adapted. Shops closed, markets shifted their busiest hours to dusk, public fountains became gathering points not just for water, but for air that had passed over cool stone. And in every district, in every parish, one building stood apart as the surest refuge: the church. Massive and cold, often half empty during the week, medieval churches became sanctuaries not only for the soul, but for the flesh. Their thick walls, arched ceilings, and heavy doors kept out more than sin. They kept out the sun. On the hottest days, old men lingered in the naves, kneeling on flagstones still cool from the night, praying not for salvation, but for a breeze. Children were hushed in darkened alcoves where statues wore dust like robes and stained glass cast blue light across stone pillars. And while these spaces gave momentary relief, the heat always waited. And so people turned to their last and most vital ally: water. When sweat turned to fever and dizziness became delirium, medieval people did not speak of heat stroke or dehydration. They spoke of humours, of fire rising in the blood, of choler thickening in the gut, of balance lost within the body's fragile harmony. The world they knew was one of alchemy and instinct, where sickness came not from microbes, but from invisible forces, celestial alignments, corrupted air, divine displeasure. And yet, within this tapestry of belief, practical wisdom often wove itself through the threads of superstition, creating a medical logic both alien and strangely familiar. At the heart of medieval medicine stood the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each linked to an element, a season, a temperament. Summer belonged to choler, dry, hot, and fiery. It inflamed the body and the soul. Physicians warned that too much heat unbalanced the choleric nature, leading to rashes, nosebleeds, anger, and madness. People were not just sick, they were burning from within. A man could look at his reflection in still water and believe his own rage had been summoned by the season itself. So treatments followed that belief. Doctors advised cooling foods: cucumbers, lettuce, melons soaked in vinegar. They spoke of wetness as remedy, of tartness as antidote. In monastic gardens, herbs were gathered not just for their flavor, but for their temperament. Mint, sage, borage, and lemon balm, plants thought to cool the body and quiet the heart. Recipes passed from hand to hand, copied in neat Latin script into the margins of apothecaries' scrolls. There were ointments made from camphor and rose oil, infusions of elderflower and watercress, poultices of lily root and barley. And for those already touched by the sun, suffering from the dreaded sunstroke, called ictus solis, or the sun's blow, the treatment was urgent. The afflicted were moved into shade, their heads wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloth, their wrists doused in cool water. Some were bled, veins opened before dawn to draw out the fire before the heat of day could seal it in. Others were fed snow, if it could be fetched from the mountains or preserved in deep cellars. The goal was not merely to cool the flesh, but to restore inner equilibrium, to chase out the heat that had settled in marrow and mind. Yet not all suffering could be traced to the body. As the heat lingered and drought hardened the earth, people turned their eyes upward. Priests spoke of judgment. Astrologers pointed to Sirius, the dog star, and warned of madness. These were the dog days, when even animals were said to go insane, when wine soured in barrels and tempers frayed like rope in a fire. The very air was accused. It had weight and rot. In towns, the scent of burning herbs hung heavy during these months. Juniper branches, myrrh, and frankincense were lit not for ceremony, but for protection. Markets reeked of rosemary and rue. Laurel was hung in thresholds. Streets were sprinkled with vinegar and rosewater. The belief was not unfounded. Without understanding bacteria, medieval people sensed what we now confirm, that heat and disease often travel together, and so they sought to purify the air. They placed bowls of cut onions in rooms to absorb invisible poisons. They carried pomanders, small fragrant orbs of metal stuffed with herbs, against their chests as shields against the unseen. But the most visible sign of communal fear came in the form of procession. When the wells dried, when crops failed to flower, when even the wind seemed to carry fever, people walked. Whole villages gathered at twilight, barefoot and silent, chanting litanies as they marched through the dust. They carried relics, bones of saints and fragments of wood said to be from the true cross. Children held candles, old women wept, and all of them turned their faces skyward, not to admire the stars, but to beg for rain. At the heart of these rituals stood belief, not only in divine mercy, but in natural justice. The heat was not random. It was punishment, or at least a test. If the people endured, if they prayed hard enough, if they gave up meat and wine and sin, then perhaps the heavens would soften, perhaps clouds would gather, and perhaps just once the air would turn cool again. When the sky cracked but no rain fell, when the wells grew shallow and crops sagged beneath the weight of dust, medieval people turned to what lay beyond understanding. They had braved the heat in silence. They had covered their skin in linen, their homes in shade, and their bodies in water drawn with blistered hands. But when the land itself began to suffer, when the barley yellowed before ripening, when the riverbed showed stones where fish once swam, fear overtook discipline, and the people begged heaven for mercy. These were the moments when the sacred and the desperate became indistinguishable. In parched fields outside Moravian villages, peasants knelt in dry furrows, their hands still black with soil as they formed the sign of the cross. The priest stood barefoot beside them, robes clinging to his back, holding aloft a crucifix that had once adorned the altar, now raised toward a cloudless sky. Behind him, children clutched hands, not understanding the full weight of what they were asking, only that the adults had grown quiet and the bread had grown thin. Processions marked these pleas. Across Italy, France, and the German principalities, people organized rogation days, marches through the countryside meant to invoke divine compassion, chanting in Latin, bearing icons, and ringing bells muffled in cloth. They moved between shrines, past scorched vineyards, and over hills where once green leaves now curled inward like clenched fists. Some fasted for days, eating only broth. Others gave up wine or meat. And when it finally rained, whether after 3 days or 3 weeks, it was not seen as coincidence. Thunder was not weather, it was divine exhale. The first drops that fell were treated like relics. Children ran laughing through the downpour, their feet slapping against wet stone, while their mothers cupped their hands to catch the blessed water and smeared it across their foreheads like holy oil. In towns, bells rang not for weddings or feasts, but for rain. Even those too weak to rise from their straw beds smiled at the sound, whispering that the Virgin had heard them, or that St. Lawrence had opened the heavens. But before that grace, the world could grow cruel. In the low valleys of Castile or the flatlands of southern Hungary, some villages faced heat so relentless that even belief began to wilt. Famine was never far behind drought, and drought never far from plague. With the water gone and the harvest spoiled, hunger crept in like smoke. Bread was stretched with ground acorns, soup made from nettles and sour milk. Livestock collapsed under their own ribs. And though the church taught that suffering purified the soul, the stomach disagreed. In some regions, villagers took to older rites, whispers from pagan pasts that lingered beneath the surface of Christian ritual. Effigies were made, sometimes of straw, sometimes of clay, shaped in the image of rain spirits or ancient gods of fertility. These figures were marched through the village, doused in water or buried in dry riverbeds. It was not heresy, not to them. It was hope, and when priests protested, they were often ignored, not out of rebellion, but exhaustion. When the corn failed and the springs ran dry, the people called to any power that might answer. The saints, too, were drafted into the battle. Saint Medard, who once prayed for rain so fervently that a cloud followed him wherever he walked, was invoked in the north. In the south, St. Swithin was called upon, his name spoken in candlelight beside empty pitchers. But it was St. Lawrence, grilled alive in Rome and now protector of fire victims, who became the symbol of August's misery. His feast, held at summer's peak, was feared as much as celebrated. Peasants would whisper, "Lawrence stokes the sun, pray he closes the oven soon." Within cloisters and abbeys, monks recorded it all. They wrote of seasons where the heat scorched parchment and melted wax, of years when the grapes fermented too early or not at all, of brothers who fainted during psalms and abbots who decreed longer vigils to test the soul through fire. Yet even among these holy men there was no consensus. Some saw the heat as penance, others as omen, but all agreed that it must be endured with discipline and prayer. For the layfolk, endurance meant more than devotion. It meant adaptation. Water was rationed with precision. Work shifted again, this time not for rhythm but for survival. Weavers relocated their looms into basements. Blacksmiths quenched fewer blades. Stonecutters paused their chisels and learned to wait. And amid all this, the people still lit candles. They still sang hymns, and they still stood beneath the sun, faces lifted, eyes shut, murmuring the only words that seemed worth saying. King, let it rain. Long after the fires died in the fields, long after the procession candles melted into dust and the riverbeds filled again with rain, the memory of the heat remained. It lingered not as a story told over wine, nor as a date etched into chronicles, but as something quieter, woven into habit, embedded in song, layered beneath superstition and prayer. The great heat waves of the Middle Ages were not forgotten because they could not be. In villages tucked between wooded hills, grandmothers still taught their daughters to rise before the birds, to fetch water with covered pails, and to hang wet cloth across the windows once the sun crested the rooftops. The rituals of survival became the patterns of ordinary life. To close the shutters by mid-morning, to bathe one's feet before sleep, to leave the well bucket floating just beneath the surface, where the water stayed cool and clean. These were not rules, they were reflexes, shaped by generations who had once watched the sky with dread and hope in equal measure. In the monasteries, scribes recorded more than scripture. They noted which herbs eased fever during the hottest months. They copied recipes for cooling tonics beside recipes for ink. They drew small suns in the margins of parchment to mark the arrival of the burning weeks, those mid-July to late August days when even stone walls could not hold back the fire. Some wrote of the dog star rising, of madness among beasts, of tempers flaring in taverns and children falling asleep in church pews without waking. Others recorded less dramatic things, how the monks opened the chapel doors at night, how they moved their meals into the shaded arcades, how they prayed more often but spoke less. City councils, too, remembered. By the 14th century, ordinances appeared in the records of Paris, Florence, and Prague. Orders to keep water buckets near wooden homes during summer, to avoid lighting cooking fires near walls, to cease all charcoal burning during peak heat. The fear of fire had carved itself into law, and even in years of gentler weather, these rules were honored like talismans, invoked against misfortune that might yet return. Municipal fountains were repaired more frequently. Wells were deepened. Shade trees were planted along narrow streets. It was not sentiment, it was strategy. Yet perhaps the deepest memory lay not in regulation or practice, but in belief. People did not forget the saints who had answered or failed to. They lit candles to St. Medard even when the clouds gathered quickly. They sang litanies to St. Lawrence with more resignation than reverence. And in the calendar of the common mind, the weeks between midsummer and the Feast of the Assumption remained marked by caution. They were the days when cloth should not be dyed, meat should not be left to hang, children should not be baptized outdoors. The very air, they believed, could turn on you. Stories survived where records did not. Old men in market squares told of summers so dry the frogs buried themselves underground. Women spoke of infants born during droughts who would not cry unless their faces were washed. A knight's tale might include the heat that softened the iron in his scabbard. A merchant's tale might end with spoiled wine and a prayer answered too late. These were not fairy stories. They were warnings disguised as memory. And when the heat returned, as it always did, the people recognized its steps before it reached the door. Because the Middle Ages were not an age of ignorance, only an age of adaptation. And though they lacked thermometers, forecasts, or modern medicine, their knowledge ran deep. It was knowledge born of exposure, of loss, of the unrelenting demand to survive with less than enough. Their wisdom came not in numbers or theories, but in rhythms, of opening windows at night, of working by starlight, of trusting that the human body could endure more than it feared, and perhaps that is what remains even now, the understanding that heat is more than temperature. It is trial, it is weight, it is a mirror held up to the limits of flesh and habit. The people of medieval Europe, wrapped in linen, soaked in sweat, and bowed under sun, taught their descendants not just how to survive, but how to remember. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.